Elijah Herring has entered the transfer portal, Tennessee's leading linebacker last year, and Tennessee fans should be unmoved by it. Not a big deal.
Okay. Why? Because that sounds crazy in and of itself to lose a guy not only to the transfer portal, but to lose him out of spring, right?
Yes, it does. And I think what happened is pretty obvious. Elijah Herring, I'm saying this nicely, guys, because quite honestly, Elijah Herring is a guy I respect. It was a very early commitment to Josh Heupel's team. He wanted to play for Tennessee. His issues last year were not lack of effort. They weren't lack of toughness. They weren't lack of mental toughness. They were lack of too small, too slow to play Mike linebacker. He just didn't have enough lateral quickness, and it's something there was no way he was going to get that fixed. So because of that, he now with Keenan Peely returning and Jeremiah Thielander, who had emerged during spring ball, I just think that there wasn't a avenue for him to play. He certainly wasn't going to be able to play Sam linebacker because he doesn't have a lot of straight line speed either. And given that fact, I think Elijah Herring entering the portal, Tennessee fans should be unmoved. If anything, wish Elijah, this is one of those where this guy's not running, he's not taking NIL money, wish him the best. As Tennessee builds more depth than they have at linebacker, I think that's this story here. There just wasn't going to be a spot for him on the roster. And, it's one of those, I know I sound like the whole, I'm such a bleeding heart here, but Dave, those guys that you just have to kind of move on from, because even though they're doing everything right, they're doing everything they should do. They just can't do what they need to do once you get the depth you need at a certain position.
Well, I could see him play for 30 seconds. I could tell you the guy wasn't a middle linebacker or an outside linebacker, either or, in the SEC. I said at the time, I think I said the very week that he started playing in place of Keenan Peely for a short time, which wasn't immediately. They tried to get Arian Carter to that gig, and that didn't work out because he got banged up. So he couldn't play. Now, he could play defensive end, but Tennessee's deep there. So my question to you and the message board, is it a little too hardcore if Heupel says you are doing everything right and you played out of position and you should have started the defensive end and we have mishandled your playing status and now there's not a place for you? Is that okay for Josh Heupel to say you're gone, you're outie? Are we at that point where that is acceptable? Because 5 years, that would get you destroyed in recruiting. Like forever. So are we at that point where that's all good?
I think it depends on how you approach it. I think that Elijah Herring, I think if you sit there and say, I'm pulling your scholarship, go, then yes, it's bad. But I think if you just kind of encourage, look, man, you're not going to play here. I can help you find another spot that I think would be a good fit for you, but you're just not going to work here. But I do think that.
Look, I want to make sure I got you. I got you right. Guy does everything right. He's never late to a class. He's never late to a team function. He's a good leader. But at the end of the day, he goes out on the practice field, and 85 scholarship players and 15 walk-on players, and all the coaches know that he's just not as good. And he says yes, sir, and no, sir, for all of that. But you're okay with Elijah Herring being told that he needs to leave?
I think, yes. And by the way, that happened even nowadays. You're more pushed into it to make room. Back in the day, though, it's not like players weren't all, I'm sure you covered Fulmer telling players, right, that just saying, I just don't think you're a good fit here. I'll keep your scholarship, but you might want to, if you want to play, you might want to look elsewhere. That's probably a difficult conversation coaches have to have. And by the way, I'm going to throw this out there, specifically related to Elijah Herring. It's not a headliner when your Mike linebacker is your leading tackler. I'm just sorry, guys. That does not mean that they're a valuable loss. Okay, your Mike linebacker should be your leading tackler. That's just how the game works. So because ESPN's headline for this is Tennessee leading tackler Elijah Herring enters portal. I get it. I'd write that headline. You want the splash, but that does not mean that he's their best linebacker or even close to their best defensive player. He was their leading tackler because he was the main starter at the position that racks up the most tackles last year. That's like saying, your quarterback enters the portal and you say their leading pass thrower, their leading pass attempter last year enters the portal.
I agree with a lot on the Mike linebacker. So, but let me ask you this. Let's put a more finite number on it. Let me ask you where he ranks among Tennessee's linebackers, where he ranks among Tennessee's defensive front players, where he ranks among Tennessee's whole defense. Because I'll tell you right now that I don't think it's very high, and I don't think you're going to think so either. So if that's the type of player that Josh Heupel has to push out the door, then it sounds rough, but I kind of understand it. Brought to you by Don Self. Customer service still matters. For 40 years, they've built their business on taking care of their customers in the greater Chattanooga area. Call Don Self, 423-396-2126, 423-396-2126. Go to donself.net, donself.net. Herring is definitely, at best, the third best linebacker on this team, obviously behind the two starters, which would be Keenan Pili and Arian Carter, we believe at this point. He is, at best, the eighth best player in the defensive front, maybe more like 10 or 12. I think Caleb's even going to take me deeper, which I'm not going to argue with him about. And as far as the whole defense, well, you got about 40 some odd players on each side of the ball. So he's somewhere in the 30s.
He is.
Maybe if they put him on a defensive end tomorrow, I would change my mind. But if this is the guy that leaves, and you can headline it however you want, ESPN, them's the breaks. It's tough. I hate it for the kid. But how much was he going to play? And do you want to go to idea? I can't tell you. Guys that you think love the University of Tennessee, Caleb. The number of guys I can't begin to tell you that really hate the University of Tennessee because they didn't get to play enough. Because they were told by a coach that it's going to work out for you, just hang tight. And they did, and then boom, their eligibility's up. So while this sounds hardcore, it's really, the transparency is probably the better way to handle it, right?
Yeah, I agree. It's the most honest way. It gets you the most respect from coaches. I think, and look, I'm just going to be honest with you with linebackers. He's at best fourth because he's also behind T-Lander. And I do think he's behind Jalen Smith, Caleb Perry, and forget.
No, I was definitely trying to be overly nice.
Yes, and don't forget, Edwin Spillman is a 4-star who committed to the system this year. We know this much. Josh Heupel recruited Elijah Herring because he wanted Caleb Herring.
And not to interrupt, they moved Spillman into a media rotation, which means they think he's a good player because they don't let you talk unless you've done something on the practice field. Go ahead.
That is true. Now, I don't know how long that lasts because guess what? Spillman's from Lipscomb Academy, and you'll know how I feel about that.
You better enjoy your damn interviews now.
Yeah, right. But yes, with all of that, they recruited Elijah to get Caleb Herring, and that was all that was about. And so I think he's 6th or 7th on the linebacker rotation alone. You're right. That's it. That's likely what he is. And at best, he's 12th on the defensive line rotation. There was no way to work him in. And with now also, I mean, a lot of times, Dave, you know this, Tennessee runs a dime package in a lot of situations. So really, they're only using one linebacker a lot of times. And
yeah, I thought about 30-40% of the time, maybe they did that. I still think you want 2 linebackers. I still think you want 3 or 4, but you're right. I mean, now my question is though, with Caleb Perry, I mean, what are your thoughts there with Caleb and where he stands? Because you just kind of explained with the Elijah connection. But what do you?
Caleb Herring is the Elijah connection. He's the defensive lineman because they're
Caleb Herring. Excuse me. What are your thoughts on the connection there?
Well, that's another reason you couldn't move Elijah Herring over to end because you've already got James Pierce and Joshua Josephs, but then you got David Hobbs, you've got Caleb Herring. I mean, you got Shandavian Bradley. Everybody is just seeing James Pierce, and they're not realizing how deep this team goes at edge rusher right now in defensive end. I mean, it's absolutely incredible, and it's only going to get better going forward. So what were you going to do? Where were you going to play him? Now,
I will go ahead and say that I think the writing's on the wall, because whether or not Caleb's right will all determine, and whether or not they're loading up for the 2024 season. I don't think most coaches think like that, but I'm beginning to be won over by Caleb's mindset. And one of the things that seems small, but it begun to win me over a little bit, was when the kid, the defensive, well, I thought he was going to be a defensive end, ended up at tight end. I can't remember his name. Is Conga?
Emmanuel Okoye.
Emmanuel Okoye. Yeah. The fact that he was put at tight end where he could develop over a couple of years, and you're not trying to get a pass rusher immediately out of him for 2024 because you need help there. I thought that was a huge statement about the program. Not to go too left of center from what you were saying, Caleb, but yeah, I mean, I think that they really like their depth at that position.
Yeah. Oh, they love their depth there. And that's what this is about. They didn't like it last year. I think there's there's another part of this too, which is, can we bring up coaching for a minute? Can we say that William Ing maybe saw that there wasn't a spot for Elijah Herring better than Brian Jean-Marie did? I mean, because I think William Ing is a better linebackers coach than Brian Jean-Marie.
So he came in and saw this guy needs to go. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's what I think happened.
Was Brian Jean-Marie too close to his players?
Well, Brian Jean-Marie probably was part of the recruiting process to get Elijah Herring, so he felt a little more connected and invested in him than William Ing did. You could tell me more about that, but I do feel like coaches are a lot more invested, particularly position coaches and players they recruited. But in general, they are. I mean, I'll just tell you, I remember the 2009 Lane Kiffin recruiting class. We can talk about what it turned into, but I think the real damage Lane Kiffin did, he kicked off half the roster, it felt like, to make room for his own recruits that year in 2009.
Who were felonious in many situations. Portions of the program brought to you by the Hemp House, the premier hemp dispensary online with a wide variety, great selection, and strict standards to ensure you only receive the best in CBD or Delta products. Hemp House Chat with 2Ts.com. Hemp House Chat with 2Ts.com. Use the promo code HOOK for 10% off. Promo code HOOK for 10% off. Can I ask you to do something that's virtually impossible, Caleb?
Sure.
Tell me who Tennessee should be concerned about in the transfer portal, who they should be concerned about losing, because I don't think anybody thought that Tyler Barron was going to jump up and leave when he did. I don't think anybody, well, Herring probably could have been speculated on, but let me ask you, who's up next? Who should Tennessee be concerned of and take care of? The show represented by Banks & Jones. Banks & Jones? Well, it's because they're Tennessee's trial attorney. You can play to win with Banks & Jones because they'll go to trial. You've heard of other lawyers. They say they'll go to trial and fight for you. They won't. They just want to settle. That's the easiest way out. Well, that's not Banks & Jones, led by T. Scott Jones. They won't settle. They'll go to trial for you. Tennessee's trial attorney. They play to win. Truly, Tennessee's trial attorney when it comes to criminal defense or personal injury. Why settle? It's Banks & Jones. T. Scott Jones. BanksandJones.com. Who should Tennessee be most concerned about getting poached in the transfer portal, Caleb?
Well, this is gun to my head having to nitpick, because up front, I'm going to say that we talked about this yesterday. I don't think a lot of players get poached in the spring transfer portal. Quite honestly,
they don't. And to be sure and clarify, they can't go to another SEC school.
Right, exactly. So I would probably say, like, none of the stars are going to be. So think about a reliable everyday blocker. I mean, or player. So that's why I said, like, Javonte Spraggins, someone who's been committed to Tennessee the whole time, but could get poached at the very end. You know, I'm not thinking guys that recently transferred to Tennessee. So I mentioned John Campbell Jr. yesterday, but I don't think he would get poached. I don't think. Yeah, I would go Javonte Spraggins. That would be the scariest one to me, is if Javonte Spraggins, Amari Thomas on the defensive line, Bryson Eason, one of those guys.
I think that would be the scariest one. But as far as most likely to leave, I'm going to go in a different direction, because I'm going to tell you, there's going to be a surprise, right? Isn't there going?
Oh, yeah.
Tyler Barron was a surprise, so there's going to be a surprise that we don't know, and it's going to happen. So I mean, we want to keep an eye on that. But I think it's any receiver that is not well established. And here's how I'm going to define well established. Obviously, Brew, right?
Yes.
Okay, so Brew McCoy, well established. From what I've been told, and man, I may eat my words, and Caleb, you know I will, but I think you know my batting average is pretty good. I think Dante Thornton has established himself as a guy who will have a position of regular playing time on this team. I know we did this last year, okay? So bear with me. Squirrel White, I think he's reestablished himself as the guy who's going to be the slot because they've realized that Dante Thornton's going to play on the outside. Then Mike Matthews, because I think he's the future. Anybody not named those 4 guys at receiver, I'm a little concerned about because the wrong guy gets in their ear and says, you know, Josh Heupel, he's a pretty good offensive coach. I don't blame you for going there, but he only plays 3 receivers pretty much for the whole season. Are you aware of that? That's what would concern me. And it'll be interesting to see if Josh Heupel changes his approach about how many receivers he plays. I think this would be the year to do it. You're not a big fan of that. That would be my concern. Any receiver not named the 4 that I just named.
Unless the receiver is Mike Matthews, every single receiver on this team is replaceable because Tennessee is so loaded at receiver. And I can tell you right now, Brew McCoy's not leaving. So
No.
Yeah. So I'm telling you guys, unless the receivers
I can tell you from a financial perspective, Brew and Dante, and to some extent Squirrel, they're not going anywhere anytime soon, even if they want to.
Yeah. So with that
but you get it.
With that in mind, you don't have to worry about any receiver leaving unless it's Mike Matthews, because I think Mike Matthews is a rare talent. Rare talent. But outside of that, every other receiver is replaceable because you're so loaded at receiver.
Is there one that, aside from Matthews, Thornton, Brew McCoy, and Squirrel White, that you would at least want to lose?
Just Matthews and Brew McCoy. Those would be the top 2 that I would at least want to lose if I'm Tennessee. Brew for this year, Matthews for the future. I think you can replace any of the other ones. I mean, literally any of the other ones that are on that roster.
You know, we didn't even mention Boo Carter either. Is that a guy that would potentially be interested if somebody came calling, because they're going to have to pay him in year 1? I believe what he's done in spring practice year 1, they're going to have to pay him. They're not going to be able to wait and pay him like they were able to do with Cooper Mays. That's not going to be the case. It's not going to work out for him.